Hello there, everyone. All right. But Jesus perceived their wickedness and said, "Why do you test me, you hypocrites?" He doesn't call them a name. They are hypocrites. Right? He's not picking on them. They're being hypocrites. And so he tells them the truth. And remember, that's what we're getting now. The Lord is trying to break through their lack of humility, and now he's going to use names, but he's going to use names that should shake them out of their sin. So he says, "Show me the tax money." And they brought him a denarius. And he said to them, "Whose image and inscription is this?" And they said to him, "Caesar's." And he said to them, "Render therefore to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's." When they had heard these words, they marveled and left him and went their way. Yeah, I bet they did. So Jesus answers this question perfectly, but it's full of wisdom for us. It's not just a beautiful argument. The coin has Caesar's face on it, so therefore money belongs to Caesar, right? But each person is the image of God. So you should render your tax payment to Caesar, but you should render your own life to God, which is actually a really interesting perspective, because what that would mean is your whole life is under the umbrella of God. Your life you're rendering unto Caesar is a very narrow portion of that. It's not like, we've got to be careful about this because he's going to come back, he's going to tell us something maybe at the end of today's Bible study. It's not that money isn't under the umbrella of God. It's not money to Caesar, right? He says the tax to Caesar. He's not saying give all your money to Caesar either, right? So what he's saying is your whole life is under God. This very small tax question, that's for Caesar. So he actually answers both perfectly. The Herodians, yeah, you should pay your taxes. The Jews, but God is superior to Caesar, right? Because even paying your taxes is in that sense serving God, because you're doing what you're being a good citizen, we would say in the modern world, right? So perfect. I mean, a perfectly well-placed answer, but a really good guide for us. Everything we have, everything in our life belongs to God. That includes 100% of our money, but some small portion of that, Caesar asks for that, Caesar gets that, right? It's not that we're not, to be anti-political or unpolitical, but we're just political to the measure that we must be, right? We got an election coming up. We should vote. We probably should vote if our conscience, if our conscience compels us. I don't want to say to those of us that can't make sense heads or tails of it either. This year, do what you can, right? But we should do for our country what our country needs appropriately, but we should not let our political views or our political ideals or our political stuff get to the level of being higher than God, right? Render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, but to God, just everything in the life of a person, render that to God. All right. Any questions on that? I mean, this really opens up a can of worms, with politics. And you all know me. I don't shy away from politics, but at the same time, as a priest, we're famous for being neutral. It's not because we're neutral about the things that are important. It's that the Bible makes very clear that politics comes and goes. So it's a thing of this world. How many times have we thought we voted for the right person and they do dumb things? And I mean, all of us do dumb things, so you can forgive that. But no human being is going to be our Savior. Jesus Christ is our Savior, right? We vote our conscience, do our best, and then render the rest of our life to God. Yeah, including our vote, as we understand, right? All right, so let's go ahead if we have no questions on that. Everybody's just totally politicked out at this point, probably. That's probably what's going on. I know I am. It's exhausting this year. And I've got new politics. I'm in a new state for an election for the first time, so I don't know anybody. That's another weird feeling. All right, so let's talk about the resurrection of the dead. 22:23. All right, so the Pharisees and the Herodians get shut down, so the Sadducees come up, okay, who say there is no resurrection. And they came to him and asked him, saying, Teacher, Moses said that if a man dies having no children, his brother shall marry his wife and raise up offspring for his brother. Now there were with us 7 brothers who died after he had married, and having no offspring. The first died after he had married, and having no offspring, left his wife to his brother. Likewise the second also, and the third even to the 7th. Last of all, the woman died also. Therefore, in the resurrection, whose wife of the 7 will she be? For they all had her. Jesus answered and said to them, You are mistaken, not knowing the Scriptures nor the power of God. For in the resurrection they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are like angels of God in heaven. But concerning the resurrection of the dead, have you not read what was spoken to you by God, saying, I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. God is not the God of the dead, but of the living. And when the multitudes heard this, they were astonished at his teaching. Okay, so the Sadducees. We're back with the Sadducees again. You might remember the Sadducees are the priestly class that runs the temple. And sometimes we forget this. The Pharisees are rabbis. They're more like, maybe for us, it's not quite this way. It would be like lay teachers or lay leaders within the church. It's not quite the same because they actually had a role like rabbis, and they would have run the synagogues. But at the temple where you would bring a sacrifice, maybe people don't know that either, you didn't bring sacrifices to synagogues. Synagogues as they are now pretty much do what they did then. You have a prayer service and you learn about the law. But at the temple you would bring sacrifices. The priests would do those sacrifices. They would kill the animal, prepare it in the way that the offering was meant to be received by God. They would offer it and barbecue it, and then whatever amount of food was allotted based on the offering, they give you back. Like if John brought his goat in and it was a certain kind of offering, they would prep it. They'd give a portion of that to God and give John and his family the barbecued meat, and they would sit down and have a picnic with God. This is the way the Old Testament sacrifice worked. So these are those people. They're the sacrificers. And the people that worked the temple. As such, they were very, very knowledgeable on the law. This is something that's often misunderstood about the Sadducees because it says they didn't believe in the resurrection. Well, that's actually not, that is true, but it's true for a reason. They held to the 5 books of Moses, right? The ones that explain how to do sacrifices, what Moses taught, all that. And the reason would be is they're priests. Their focus is on those 5 books because those 5 books tell them the rules, tell them how to do their job. So it's not like they don't believe in the resurrection of the dead just because they have a political or a theological opinion. They don't believe in the resurrection of the dead because they can't see it in the 5 books of Moses. Most of the things, if you think about verses about the resurrection of the dead in the Old Testament, they're in the Psalms and they're in the prophets. Mostly, in the wisdom as well, but Psalms and prophets, right? That's where you would go if somebody said, well, prove to me the resurrection from the Old Testament. Show you Ezekiel. Oh, Ezekiel. Okay, then Isaiah. Well, no, okay. Well, then Jonah. Like these are all prophets. You wouldn't say Genesis. But Jesus does. As it happens. And he points out that we're not reading our Bible right. He tells the Sadducees. So they denied the resurrection actually because they thought the first 5 books of Moses was everything that needed to be known, and that everything that came after that was interpreting the law. Okay? So it's not that they even denied that there was value in those other books. There was value, but there was nothing new after the 5 books. Everything was referencing something in the 5 books. So if it said resurrection, they're going to look at the 5 books and say, well, that can't be what it's about. It must be symbolic. Okay? Jesus fixes this, but we'll see that in just a second. The other thing we need to be familiar with is this Levirate law. So in Deuteronomy 25, 5-6, there's this law, and it's a specific law for a specific time. So I'll read it real quick. So here's the law they're referring to. Now think about it. I mean, they really know their Old Testament to cite this. If brothers dwell together and one of them dies and has no son, the widow of the dead man shall not be married to a stranger outside the family. Her husband's brother shall go into her, take her as his wife, and dwell with her. Then it shall be, the firstborn son she bears shall be named by the name of his dead brother, that his name may not be blotted out of Israel. So this law was intended to make sure that any family that had an allotment from God, a gift from God to have land, that it would never leave that family. Okay, so you would always have a home. Now, I want to be very clear, that's an incredible law. The idea that your family got allotted money or got allotted land in Israel, and by God's law, he's going to make sure your family keeps that. So no matter what happens at some point, you would always have somewhere to go. No one in God's community is going to be without home and without food. That was God's plan. So this law might seem really weird to us that two people get married, but the sister, in this case, the brothers, he has unmarried brothers. The first guy dies and the second brother steps in. And they're like, oh, that's kind of weird. But the purpose is important. Because after they had a kid, he would get the original guy's name for his last name, what we would call his last name. And then that would give him an allotment. And that would maintain that no one ever lost land in Israel. Okay? Does that make sense? So that's the Sadducees' point. And if you want to get even deeper in the Sadducees' mindset, sort of, you would actually be able to say this makes total sense with how they even interpreted the law. Right? Because they're trying to say, you all have got all, as they say in a Jesus Christ Superstar, you all have got heaven on your minds. But God has the earth on his mind. He's saying, how are you going to allot land, and so on and so forth. And so Jesus is coming into this conversation, and he corrects a lot of misunderstandings very, very quickly. Jesus explains that they don't even understand the resurrection. They think it's going to be a continuing of this life. And he says, no, it's far more heavenly than you've imagined. They're going to be like the angels in heaven, right? So he says people don't get married in heaven, but they are like the angels. Now, this is important, too, because in the Orthodox Church, we do believe that marriage is forever, that what happens when we're married in the church, that continues on into eternity. That's an eternal relationship that's forged at that point. But the reason we believe this is because souls get bound together, right? The two become one flesh. So in this case, that relationship forms and impacts your soul, so that goes with you into heaven, obviously. Okay? But what doesn't happen is no one gets married in heaven. No one's given in marriage in heaven. Right? What we do in this life affects us in the afterlife, but we don't say that then this life just continues on and, she stays married to the first brother for eternity. It's not like that. Does that make sense? So Jesus isn't giving us a whole rundown of all of what heaven's like. He's just saying, guys, you got to raise your eyes much higher than you're looking. We're not just continuing Israel for another bazillion years, right? Then he proves to them the resurrection, but notice what he uses. He uses Genesis. So what happens is they're saying, oh, there's nothing in the first 5 books of Moses about the resurrection from the dead. And Jesus is like, oh, but there is. So he says, have you not read what was spoken to you by God, saying, I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. God is not the God of the dead, but of the living. So he's telling them, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob have to be alive, or God would not have said, I am their God. Now, we might even be able to say that if he was going to say that, he could have said, I was the God of Abraham, I was the God of Isaac, I'm now the God of Jacob. But he doesn't say that either. He says it in the present tense, I am the God of Abraham, I am the God, right? So he is present, he is God, he is Abraham's God right now. He is Isaac's God right now. And so Jesus is saying, you're all not reading careful enough. Beautiful. So now, not only has he raised their minds to spiritual things, but he's also let them know, the Bible scholars you think you are not. Right? You're not reading careful enough. And they marvel. I mean, that's, when they hear this, they were astonished at his teaching. Um, so once again, too, and this teaches us a lot about how we should approach the scriptures, simply because we read the scriptures every day, or we go to this Bible study, or maybe we do a lot of Bible study. I love to read about the Bible. Like in my free time, I'm reading a commentary on Exodus. Like it's fun for me, but I don't know everything about the Bible. And so we have to kind of remain humble. We know or understand the things we know and understand. We don't know and understand everything. But there is sometimes movements of people will come along and they'll make us question our understanding of the scriptures, because they'll say that theirs is deeper, or they'll say they go to this really cool Bible study and it's got all these amazing teachings or whatever. But we need to remember that we don't have to go and understand every doggone thing. We just have to have the humility to know I'm only required to do what I understand. Right? I understand this about the scriptures. I don't have to understand. I'm not going to understand everything about it. See, I can't imagine Jesus' answer to the Sadducees is like, oh, you all got to get better at doing your homework. They're doing their homework. That's not the problem. They're not humble while they're doing their homework. Mm-hmm. Right? So it's okay for us. That needs to be okay for us. We need to be willing to do the things we actually understand. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. God doesn't ask us to be brilliant. He doesn't ask us to be scholars. He asks us to obey him. And most of the times the teachings of Jesus are very clear. It's not a lack of clarity. Or if we don't get the whole thing, we at least get something out of it. But how often do we not do anything because we don't feel like we get the whole thing? See what I mean? Mm-hmm. Yeah. We don't have to get it all. And I don't think he's asking the Sadducees here to do that. But he is saying, guys, you all call yourselves Bible scholars, and somehow you missed this. And he says it, by the way, that verse, that's all over the Old Testament. So it's like, oops, right?
So it's a repeat it.
Yeah, exactly.
You're welcome.
Yeah, so anyway, so we've got now the Sadducees have been put down. So now the Herodians are down, Pharisees are down, Sadducees are down. So we've kind of seen the gloves come off, as it were. Jesus has not gone toe-to-toe with them yet because he's continued to work with them. But now we're at the end. There's no more time left. They need to get on this. The cross is looming. The cross is Friday. Like this week in the Bible, right? So he's trying to get them prepared and get them free of the judgment that inherently ensues from this. Okay, so we're at verse 34. But when the Pharisees heard that he had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered together. So they're like, all right. So we're going to go in ourselves. All right, the last time we sent our disciples, he torched them, but we're going in it. And you got to love it. Isn't that our attitude? It's like, well, he doesn't like our enemies, so I guess he's our friend. So here we go. But they do try to trick him again. Then one of them, a lawyer. Now, a lawyer, this isn't like we would say like a court lawyer. This is like a Bible lawyer, more like what we'd call a canonist in the church. Somebody who really knows the rules of the first 5 books of Moses. Okay? A lawyer, and asked him a question, testing him. Okay, so we're there. And saying, "Teacher, what is the great commandment in the law?" Okay, you all feel that? It's a test. Oh, you're so great. Let's see how you handle this one. Jesus said to him, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the first and great commandment, and the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself." On these 2 commandments hang all the law and the prophets. So what's the test here? If Jesus says any law is greater than another, he undermines some portion of the law. So they can say, oh, he doesn't care about this law, right? Oh, he likes the first commandment, so he doesn't care about the 6th commandment, and make him look bad, right? But if he affirms no commandment is greater than another, then he admits he can't answer the question. And so this kind of ends up being the ancient Israelite version of, can God create a rock so big he can't lift it? Right? It sounds smart, but it's just not. And Jesus answers him very, very straightforwardly. Jesus says, love God with your whole self, your whole heart, your whole soul, and with the rational mind. That's what he focuses on. You'll notice all of these things that he talks about here are the invisible part of who we are, because he began this conversation talking about the image of God. We've talked about this in this class, but just a reminder, the fathers teach that, and this is what the Lord is saying here, this is why the fathers teach it, that the soul, our immaterial aspect of who we are, that's the image of God. The body is the image of the soul. So the two are directly linked. Okay? But the higher aspect of us is what we call the invisible aspect of the immaterial aspect of us, or what we sometimes call the soul. The problem in English is we don't have good, perfect terms for talking about that immaterial aspect, because every time I say it, it comes with baggage I don't want to bring with me, right? So for instance, if I say the soul, do we include in the heart? Do we include heart in that? Sometimes we don't. Okay, but also we need to understand that the senses of the body correspond to the soul. Like everything about my body corresponds so intricately to the soul that even the body is high. It's a high thing. It's beautiful and important, and actually for humans necessary. We're not supposed to be disembodied, right? When we die and our soul is separated from our body, it's a tragedy. God doesn't like that. How do we know God doesn't like that? Because he's going to put us back together again, right? We're resurrected. We're given bodies again. Continuous with this body, but more glorious. Why do we know that? Because Jesus did. All right? They don't always recognize him. He can walk through walls, so it's a little, his body's different, but he does have one because they can touch him, right? Okay? So we will also have bodies forever. So this is all kind of important in understanding what's going on here. So when he says the heart, the soul, and the mind, he's referring to the invisible part, but that does not mean he's denigrating the body. It's that it rests on and uses the body. The body is the reflection of the interior. Okay. Okay. So then he adds, and the next is like it. Okay. So love God with everything you are, and then love your neighbor as yourself. And so he actually ends up tying the two together so tightly, it ends up one, right? Shockingly, Jesus has summarized the entire law and the prophets in two sentences, right? But if you love God with all your mind, heart, soul, and strength, you embody what it means to be the image of God, but then you have to love everybody like that. So you can't separate love of neighbor from love of God. St. John says, if you do not love your neighbor who you can see, then how can you love God whom you cannot see? So that's the idea. When St. Paul summarizes the law, he's going to say, love your neighbor. Because for him, that takes care of the whole thing. Because if we're truly loving our neighbor as ourselves, that ourselves goes back to loving God and living properly with him. So it turns out whenever you say either one of these, you bring both with you. Okay, so one thing that we want to be careful about when we hear Jesus talk about the commandments, because of the time we live in, just in history, is we need to notice Jesus never lightens God's standards. We don't have, there's this weird view that we have now in the modern world. It is not an orthodox view. It just is alive. And that is that Jesus came and did away with the Old Testament. That is not what's going on here. He fills it up to the brim top is what he's actually doing. He says that in Matthew 5. He's filling it up to the brim top. So what he's really doing is he's taking a law and then he's filling it to the brim with spiritual meaning, not just the physical meaning. Okay? So that's what he did with this passage. He says he takes the whole law and he raises it up to the spiritual height. And they realize, oh, that summarizes all of Moses. And now all of Moses has been taken up into this much higher spiritual mentality. Less about keeping rules and more about complete and total outpouring of love toward God and neighbor. like I should give to the poor in the Old Testament. No, this is you live for the poor. You are the stewards of God's gifts to the world. If you have something more than you need, you're a steward to give it to someone in need. That's what you mentioned today. God gives us these people in need because we are supposed to be stewards. This is a Bible where I should have written it down. I just read it this morning. We're stewards of the gifts of God. So God gives us gifts, and then we meet people and we dole them out. Because apparently God thinks we're able to do that. There are other people in this world, they're not so good at doling things out. They don't, manage money or manage business or manage family as well as other people. But those people who do, they're given gifts to give to others. Isn't that interesting? This is how God does it. And then those people pray for those people. So we're all saved together. All right. So this is why when we donate to people, a lot of times we'll donate money to a charity, but we'll donate it in the name of somebody, a loved one, or we'll donate it in the name of someone who's departed. This is so they'll pray for that person. It's not really buying prayers, but it's kind of like that. It's like, I'm going to do my job to my neighbor, and then my neighbor is going to do that job to God. And then we have this beautiful reciprocal relationship. Yeah. So Jesus isn't lowering the standard. He's not doing away with a single law of Moses. He's trying to show that all the law of Moses is about loving God and loving neighbor. Now we've talked about why don't we keep all the laws of Moses. We don't keep the beard trimming laws of Moses. Why? Because that was to the priests, and that was to people inside that covenant community, the circumcised Jewish people. But we're all Gentiles here. We weren't held to those same standards. We were held to the Ten Commandments and a handful of other rules. That was universal, according to God. Okay? Don't murder people was an everybody rule. Don't trim the edges of your beards, a rule for Levites practicing in the temple in Jerusalem for the covenant community that was circumcised. Does this make sense? This is also why Paul runs into the problem of Jews and Gentiles not getting along. Because the Jews are keeping kosher, the Gentiles come in, they're not keeping kosher. And they're saying, Gentiles, you got to keep kosher. And Paul goes, no, they don't. No, they don't. The law says they don't. They're like, yeah, but now they're Christians. Now they're Jews. No, they're not Jews. We're different. I mean, not different. We're not Jews. I mean, Paul was very Jewish. But he's saying, we're one new community. Everybody's not subject to the law of Moses. Never was, never will be. Isn't that interesting? So that's where Paul's letters are. A lot of times it's like, well, now how do we get along? Because so-and-so's got to eat kosher pickles and the other guy can eat any pickles he wants. It's actually like the fight they get into is over eating. How are we going to, can't even sit together. No, we can sit together. He has to explain all that. All right. Well, we finished this section and we're about halfway through. Do we have any questions? This next section, we're going to start really getting into just chopping. Any questions? Mm-hmm. All right, let's keep going. While the Pharisees were gathered together, Jesus asked them, saying, what do you think about the Christ, the anointed one, the Messiah? Christ is Greek, Messiah is Hebrew, same word. Whose son is he? And they said to him, the son of David. He said to them, how then does David in the Spirit call him Lord, saying, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand till I make your enemies your footstool. If David then calls him Lord, how is he his son? And no one was able to answer him a word, nor from that day did anyone dare question him anymore. So Jesus goes, we would say in like argument, goes on the offensive here. But of course, that's not what he's doing. He's giving them a test. And the reason is, why has Jesus interacted with the Pharisees the way he has up to this point? To open their hearts to humility. They will not humble themselves. And they can't be saved without humility. So he gives them a great opportunity right here. So here's the three possible outcomes. They acknowledge, I don't know the answer. That's actually a really good question, Jesus. What do you think? That'd be a great answer to Jesus. I think Jesus would be very happy with that answer. I don't know. I never thought of that, Jesus. What do you think? And then he could explain to them, well, it's because the Christ is also the Son of God. And so therefore, he would call his son his son Lord, because he actually is higher than him, even though he's his son. And he would just explain the scriptures, and everybody would go on their merry way, and everybody would be happy, and the Sadducees would be saved, or the Pharisees would be saved. But that's not what they do. And then the second possibility is they know the answer. Okay, so he asks some brainiac Pharisee, and the Pharisee's like, well, actually, it's because obviously the Messiah is the Son of God, and explains it to Jesus. And Jesus is like, that's really good. I'm him. Mm-hmm. They're like, yeah, we're all saved, and we all go on our merry way. But they don't do that either. But if they can't answer his question, they're refuted. And there might be humility in that. They'll know he beat us on our own territory, right? And they stop testing him. Unfortunately, the only thing it achieves is they stop testing him because, of course, we know they're going to plot to kill him, but they can't beat him. And so now they're scared. They don't want to deal with him. Okay? So they kind of recede, which leads us right into this next chapter. Which is where I said we're going to start chopping at this because now here we go. You're going to see it. Then Jesus speaks to the multitudes and to his disciples. Okay, so you can imagine how this is going. These people, these various factions are coming at him. This is the way Matthew's painting it, right? Herodians, disciples, Sadducees, Pharisees, and he shuts them all down. And it's like these guys, they could know what they're talking about, but they choose not to or whatever. And now here he comes back at them. There's nobody to talk to. These people who are trying to kill him, they're gone. They've fled. They've been beaten. So now he turns to the multitudes. He turns to the people. He says, the scribes and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. Therefore, whatever they tell you to observe, that observe and do. But do not do according to their works. For they say and they do not do. Okay? Now notice what he says there. This is a really great Bible verse for us. He explains to the people that they should understand that these guys don't behave. They're not honest. They're not true. They're not living the spiritual life. But they are teaching them the Bible. They are teaching them the scriptures. So they should do what the scriptures teach. But they should not do what they see the Pharisees and scribes doing. Because, as Jesus says often to them, they are hypocrites. They teach it and they don't do it. But this is a great reminder for us because this also cuts us off from being able to say, well, I'm not going to do thus and such because that bishop is wicked or because that priest is no good so-and-so, right? Yeah, if they're no good so-and-so, that's really sad. And Jesus will deal with them because that is the sin in the Old Testament that you cannot do. Cannot be a dishonest cleric, okay? Whether government leader or church leader. God will deal with us. God help me. Pray for me. On the other hand, that doesn't free us from doing what God teaches us to do. Do what they do, or do what they say. Don't do what they do. They're not good examples. Okay? So this kind of actually really helps our conscience, I think, a little bit. Because what are we supposed to do when we don't really feel like our leaders are who they need to be? Well, as much as we can, in other words, as much as is in keeping with God's teachings, we need to obey and do our best. Does this mean that we shouldn't look for bad priests or bad bishops to be removed? Of course we should. That's necessary. It's not wrong to if you're called for some reason to deal with that issue, yeah, deal with that issue. But what it also means is that doesn't give us the right to just like up and leave Jesus because some of his followers are no good, right? And Jesus is dealing with the hypocritiest of the hypocritiest here. So we know that that would apply to us too, right? If it applies to the Pharisees, it certainly applies to us in the New Testament. Okay, so the next verse. So he's explaining how they don't do what they should be doing. They bind heavy burdens hard to bear, and they lay them on men's shoulders, but they themselves will not move them with their fingers. Since they are weak and sinful, one would hope that they would go easy when applying the law, but actually they're easy on themselves and harsh with others. Okay? I don't keep the law, but you should. This is like me, eating a cheese pizza during the fast but then being like upset with Bella because she's having cheese pizza. Right? It's like, well, I can. I'm a priest. I can have cheese pizza. But what's the deal? Right? So they have all these rules, but the way they're applying them is backwards. They're being like really hard on their neighbor and really easy on themselves. The saints are very clear. That's the opposite of the right answer. We should hold ourselves to the highest standard. If we go out, if it's the fast, we're trying to do the fast to the ability our health allows. Right? And according to our spiritual father's guidance on that. But our neighbor asks us, we might say, eat what you need to eat. You go easy on them. I get that a lot. Priests have to get that a lot. Father, what should I do? Don't worry about it. Right? There's other times to talk about this at the dinner table. Is not the time to do this. We don't judge each other's plates, right? I remember the first time I went out with a priest on a fast day when I was newly Orthodox. I probably wasn't even Orthodox yet. I didn't know it was a fast day, actually, I think I remember. And then I had just learned about it. We sat down and we went to this restaurant. I couldn't find anything on the fast. I was so upset. And so I ordered something that was close, which I looked back on. I was wrong. It didn't work. Okay? It wasn't on the fast. And, of course, really embarrassed. This is how I handle embarrassment. I said to my spiritual father, I hope I did okay with the fast. And he goes, you're fine. And he ordered the same thing I did. Oh. So, all right. So hard with ourselves, but easy with others, right? That's the attitude that we want to have. This is not the attitude that the Pharisees have, though. But we need to remember that all the saints are this way. People say, Father, why do you have church in the middle of the week? Why do you have all this church? Well, it's not to make anyone feel bad. It should just have more church, right? Because I'm a priest. I should be in the altar. But that isn't a rebuke of anybody. I'm not trying to make some grand gesture to, rebuke anyone, It's kind of a thing. Okay, so now verse 5. As I said, we're just chopping now. By all their works, they do it to be seen by men. They make their phylacteries broad and enlarge the borders of their garments. Those had a spiritual meaning back then. So they're basically like, they would be like, like one day you see my cross is like this big, and then the next day it's like this big. And, it's like, did anybody see my cross? That's kind of the idea. Trying to look super priesty. I don't know what that might look like. What might that look like? It's everything I can do. I start growing my beard like this, and I just look like I wandered out of the woods from Saint Seraphim's own hermitage to try to look holy to you. That's what we're talking about. They're trying to look holy. They love the best places at feasts and the best seats in the synagogues. Pardon me. I think you're in my seat. If you could just move, that's the priest's seat. Okay. Greetings in the marketplaces and be called Rabbi, hey! Yeah. What's that? Yeah. Yes, I'm here. You're welcome. And of course, we all know this is a danger for anybody with any authority. Governors, right? Presidents. They love to be seen by men. Yeah, that's a good sign that we don't need to be don't need to be too close to that person. Now, here's a controversial verse. But you do not be called rabbi, for one is your teacher, the Christ, and you are all brethren. Do not call anyone on earth your father, for one is your Father, he who is in heaven. And do not be called teachers, for one is your teacher, the Christ. But he who is greatest among you shall be your servant, and whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. So it's controversial for obvious reasons, right? This Bible verse gets trotted out against priests and against people who are part of historic Christian churches who still call their priests father. Now, number one, the easiest answer to that question, if you ever get it, if you ever have to answer for your orthodoxy or historical Christian belief, there's no way that's what this passage is about because it hadn't happened yet. That'd be number one. Okay? Priests weren't being called father like we call them now. He's referring to something at a much deeper spiritual level. It can't be taken literally. For on the literal level, he's saying we couldn't call anyone who teaches us a teacher. Don't be called teacher. Only one's your teacher, the Christ. Oh, so what's my teacher then? Right? No Sunday school teachers, no school teachers, and I also can't call my dad my father. Not his point. Does everybody agree? Like, that would make no sense. This phrase would make no sense. What he's doing then is like a figure of speech. And this was really common in kind of Jewish. Jesus does it actually quite a bit. It's overstating things to take something to a higher level. Okay, so he's taking a common human thing and raising it to a spiritual level. You shouldn't be called teacher. God is the only teacher. Don't call anyone father on earth, for only one is your father, that is God. This is supposed to mean then, and this is how it feels to me as a priest being called father, is it is a reminder to me that I'm called to be as holy as my heavenly Father. Only one is truly the Father. Are you representing him well? Now take that home, fathers. Right? If my kids say, Dad, am I reflective of my heavenly Dad? You see what I mean? So what Jesus is really saying is no one can even rightly be called Father if God is Father. But then we all who are called Father must imitate him. How do you not call a teacher a teacher? It's almost a verb. It's a person who teaches, like a teacher. He means if you're a teacher, you should be a reflection of the heavenly teacher. Not literally don't call anyone a teacher. You go to school and you're just like, I don't know what you are, sir, like, I don't know, but you're not my teacher. Jesus says I can't. Now, just to prove my point, 1 Corinthians 4, St. Paul himself calls himself a spiritual father. I do not write this to make you ashamed. This is 1 Corinthians 4. But to admonish you as my beloved children. For though you have countless guides in Christ, you do not have many fathers, for I became your father in Christ Jesus through the gospel. That's St. Paul. St. Paul calls himself a father. And then in Acts 7 verse 2, brethren and fathers, hear me. The God of glory appeared to our father Abraham. He uses it twice. This is St. Stephen. Surely he's not sinning against Jesus, right? It's the pure martyrdom of Stephen. It's not him turning away from Jesus. So it doesn't literally mean do not call anyone father, like literally. It means call someone father who exhibits that relationship properly. All right. So we killed that. Did we beat that dead horse enough? All right. No questions?
I have a question.
Yeah.
So I'm just, in reading this, I know often when we refer to him, meaning God, we use a capital H.
Yeah.
So in just reading this, and they said there's a small f, and when they talk to anyone on earth is your father, but when they talk about God, it's a capital F.
Yeah.
And then the same thing with teacher.
Yeah.
Small f and then, or T, excuse me, and a capital T for the teacher. So I can see how that would be read then. Don't call on anyone on earth father, meaning not the father. When maybe it should, the confusion would be, don't call anyone father with a capital F. Because there's only one capital F Father, following what I'm saying? I do, yeah. In the Greek, these are the same words, and it was all written in capital letters. Originally, there were no lowercase letters back then. So the meaning that's interpretive of this passage. The English writer is trying to interpret it by putting caps where we feel like honor caps go. But actually, to your point, the point is the same, right? Mm-hmm. It's the idea that no one is a father as God is a father, but the word father needs to be judged by the one who is truly the father. Yeah. But I can see how that could be confusing with the
Oh, yeah.
Not making that a capital saying you're not it,
Yeah, and it's a classic Reformation move. So when the Reformation reacts against the priesthood of all the these corrupt these perceived to be corrupt priests, they see that and they read it for their times. We shouldn't even be calling them Father. Well, except for some reason nobody kind of pointed out. It was like, yeah, but that wasn't what Jesus was talking about.
Exactly.
Like that's not the problem here. What is he really talking about? Remember, it's about abusing authority. It's really about being a hypocrite. That's what he's talking about. He's saying, like, don't seize on the title Father, right? Metropolitan Saba gave a great talk on this at their symposium. He was saying, we were talking about confession. So we were talking about the priest's role as a spiritual father, as a guide, as a spiritual guide. And he actually really made the point, it's like, spiritual fatherhood is earned over time. Now, we're all fathers in some sense, but the relationship of father to son, the ability to like give guidance beyond just scriptural guidance, really is earned over a long period of relationship with a person. And it's not just, hey, you put black clothes on and all of a sudden you can be someone's spiritual father. And I think that kind of goes to your point too. Mm-hmm. It's like, we're called Father, but then what Jesus is getting at, we need to be truly a father. We need to be a father after our father's own heart, or a teacher after our teacher's own heart. And we don't want to be called that. Like, that's not a goal of ours, right? It should be scary to be called anything that's God's called, right? If God is called good, it's like, oh. So you're like, well, I'm not good. If God is good, then I'm not him. Right, so to always give us a little pause. And I think that's what Jesus is getting at here. Can't be literal, or basically no Christian has ever kept it, including St. Paul in 1 Corinthians 4. Okay, so verse 11, we'll just keep chopping because these are just independent, passages here. So verse 11 here is, but he who is greatest among you shall be your servant. And whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself shall be exalted. Okay, so that's what Jesus is getting at. If you exalt yourself to be called Father, then you're going to get thrown down. And of course, we know this is true. If you elevate yourself, your hypocrisy is going to undermine anything you're trying to do. Right? Like Dr. Mark, you were a doctor in a hospital setting, but if somebody with no degree and no practice started calling themselves doctor, it isn't going to be too long before somebody knows that real quick, right? Their actions undermine their lack of education. And in the same way with like our spiritual life, if someone's trying to go around calling themselves some guru, but they haven't lived the spiritual life, it's going to undermine that title. That's what Jesus is getting at here. So whoever exalts himself, if you call yourself father, teacher, put yourself on YouTube to garner a following, right? To try to get an audience. You're going to get humbled. But he who humbles himself, that is those people who go about their work, doing their job as God has handed it to them, they will be exalted. And that is not in an earthly way necessarily, but certainly in heaven. All right, so that's really Jesus' point. And that's what we always got to look for in the Bible, is what is the point it's driving at before we look at a verse like, do not call anyone Father. Because you'll notice now in context, it's not like he's just talking about words not to say. It's not the context. The context is abusing authority, wanting authority for show, but not earning that authority. So obviously, again, that's not what he's talking about in this passage. All right, verse 13. But woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you shut up the kingdom of heaven against men. For you neither go in yourselves, nor do you allow those who are entering to go in. Okay? 14. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you devour widows' houses, and for a pretense make long prayers. Therefore you will receive greater condemnation. All right, so the dark side of religious culture can be using religion to lock people out of holiness. Okay? Since the Pharisees and scribes aren't living a holy life, they don't want anyone else to get in either. And again, this can look like being harder on other people than we are on ourselves. Okay? This is really a warning to people like myself. right? You don't ever want to create a situation where somebody comes into confession and you're shutting the door, right? Why did you do that? That's awful, right? That's not our attitude. And the same way with fasting or anything else, we want to be easier on others, but hard on ourselves. So judgment against church leaders is more harsh than anyone else. His reference to devouring widows' houses is taking advantage of the simple. So the idea here might be like if I'm doing home visits and praying services to get money. Okay? So like I go over to the widow's house and I eat the meatballs and whatever because she always gives me $150 every time I come over. So then I start going every Thursday. Okay? They're devouring widows' houses. The widow is just thankful to have a visitor. They're thankful that the priest came. They're glad that he came, and they're excited because it means something to them. So they'll give anything. The devouring widows' houses is taking it, knowing that, oh, I can really benefit from this person. Now, there's a weird thing being a priest, I have to admit, is that you also can't say no. Sometimes you'll go to people's houses and you're like, I don't want to accept anything from you. But you can't say no because it is an offering to God. But you can see the difference between accepting an offering to God and praying for the blessing of that person because they're giving it really to God, not to the priest. And then I, as a priest, owe them something in return, which is to pray for them and to care for them and all these things. But this is devouring widows' houses. This is weaseling your way into like, oh, I bet if I do an icon project, I bet I could put some money in that budget for me. That's devouring widows' houses. Okay. Or start calling everyone on an anniversary for their loved one to drum up memorial services, right? So maybe somebody will give me a check. This is the image that we should have here. Another thing, and this could be one that we can actually apply to ourselves, would be telling people what they want to hear to make them feel better, even if that isn't what Christ and the church taught. Okay? Because that's another way to devour widows' houses. They want to hear, oh, everything's fine. And so you give it to them to win them and to, kind of have this false relationship, when in the reality is that's not what Jesus or the church taught. And therefore, as a priest, I have no right to teach anything if the church hasn't given me it to teach it. This is not mine to give, right? So that's a way of applying that. Well, let's mark off there because we're going to keep. Actually, let's take the next one. Hold on. Okay, yeah, let's do this next one, 15, just because it kind of is a standalone, and then we'll get this real big one next week. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you travel land and sea to win one proselyte, and when he is won, you make him twice as much a son of hell as yourselves. Well phrased. And we're starting to see Jesus is really pounding on that shell that pride shell. This is a rebuke of the desire to make converts, but not instruct them in holiness. Right? They teach them the rules, and they become, they can wield the Bible like an axe, but they can't actually do anything. You make them twice the son of hell you are. Why twice the son? Well, because at least they know the law. Well, now they go and they don't teach them the law well enough, and they don't keep it. Right? Twice the son of hell. So this is where, again, maybe the careful thing for us would be is that we don't want to win. Proselytes are people who are coming to the faith, converts or whatever you want to say. We don't want to win people to the faith by not giving them the whole faith, like lying to them or giving them half the story, right? And again, telling the whole truth about what we believe to those who are trying to walk in the ways of God. Or if I'm teaching a Bible study, I have to say what it says. I can't be like, well, that was pretty harsh. We'll just not worry about that. No, we need to know. If it's hard, we need to do the hard thing. All right. Let's go ahead and pray, and then if we can stay for any questions or concerns. Yeah, it's only going to get more intense here. It's ramping up to a pretty big saying here. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. O Lord, now lettest thou thy servant depart in peace, according to thy word. For mine eyes have seen thy salvation, which you have prepared before the face of all people, a light to lighten the Gentiles, and the glory of thy people Israel. Glory to the Father, and to the Son,